Hi, Sean. Welcome to the live show.
Hi, thanks for having me on the show.
And I think I did a mistake in the beginning as I forgot to unmute myself. I was just reading the comments, and I think I was all this time I was speaking, and I just couldn't unmute myself. But I think I'll just go ahead and ask you to give a little introduction about yourself, as I think I missed that part.
Okay, I'm Shaun Walker. I'm a technical director with Cognizant Soft Vision. I guess my claim to fame is that I was the original creator of a very popular open source project called .NetNuke. And I am also involved with the .NET Foundation on the advisory council and the project committee. And most recently, I've been involved with a new open source project called Oqtane, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today.
It sounds pretty interesting, Sean, that you are the original founder for .NET Nuke and you're now working on Octane. Now, I personally, Sean, I have not worked on .NET Nuke, but looks like it was pretty famous in the community, especially from Microsoft.NET framework. Would you like to go ahead and talk a little bit about what was .NET Nuke, what it actually did, and how you actually moved from .NET Nuke DNN to Octane?
Okay, yeah. So I started .NET as an open source project way back. I was working on it in 2001, 2002, just as a hobby project, and then I released it as an open source project in late 2002. And at that time, there really wasn't much in the way of open source projects on the Microsoft platform. So it was really one of the pioneering open source projects. And the community responded very quickly to it because there weren't any frameworks sort of that nature which helped you accelerate your web development as much as .NET did, and that was the real goal behind it. And so worked on that for a number of years. We actually formed a company around it. We raised 3 rounds of venture capital. And so I was very focused on .NET from 2003 all the way through to 2014. At which point I left the company. And then I took some time off in terms of being involved with open source, other than being involved with the .NET Foundation. And I guess it was 2018 that Microsoft started talking about Blazor. And I was really interested in Blazor because of the component model that it has, which I've always been a big fan of building software using components. And that was something that was a little bit lacking in earlier frameworks such as MVC. So when Microsoft came out with Blazor, I jumped on board, and that was in the early preview stages. And I thought, I could try to build a proof of concept framework application using Blazor, which was obviously I was successful in doing that. And that resulted in an open source project called Oqtane.
That sounds pretty interesting, Sean. I think Blazor has been taking market a lot these days. Everyone is talking about the Blazor, right? We also had Michael in our AMA show who talked about what you can achieve with Blazor, how it is so much competent than the other frameworks available in the market. What is so much exciting about the Blazor that you got into this Blazor framework?
So I really like the component model that it's built on. So the ability to build reusable components that you can combine together, either within the same application or across different applications. This was a concept that was very popular in the early versions of the .NET framework. Many of us remember web forms and the control model and the fact that you could use third-party controls to really accelerate your web development efforts. And again, so Blazor, with its strong component model, offers that same capability again. And I also really like the fact that you can choose different hosting models with Blazor. So you can choose to host it on the server or on the client, and there's going to be future hosting models as well that Microsoft come out with. So it's a very adaptable technology that can be used in a variety of different scenarios, which I think is super powerful.
That's great. I think Blazor is pretty interesting. And let's get to the topic for today, that is Octane rocket fuel for Blazor, right?
All right.
So, right. So that's the title is pretty interesting. So a quick check on what is Octane and what we are going to cover in this session today.
Yeah, so I have a few slides I'm going to walk through which describe Octane from a high level, and then I'll dive into some of a demonstration of the actual application and the code. So I think that that'll give a sort of a better understanding of the full picture of what Octane provides. I
All
guess with that,
right,
I'll just
so let
jump.
me go ahead and pull your stream. There we have.
All right. All right, yeah, so we're going to talk about Octane today. And yeah, I like the tagline rocket fuel for Blazor because I guess the whole point of Octane is that it accelerates your efforts in terms of building applications on Blazor. So I guess just a refresher on what web application frameworks are. I mean, they are frameworks that are designed to accelerate web development of web applications, services, and APIs. And what they often provide is a standard way to build and deploy web applications. So it's sort of a standard way, a standard architecture that you can use out of the box. And web frameworks often automate the framework or automate the overhead associated with building web applications. The Octane framework is a modular application framework, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means in a moment. But it does allow you to rapidly create modern web applications. And the main thing is, I mean, you should be able to do it using less code because you can rely on a lot of the functionality that is already present in the framework itself. So it provides a robust set of application building blocks, and I'll share what those are in a moment. It's an open source project licensed under the MIT license, which is one of the most permissive open source licenses. And Octane Framework provides additional capabilities that are not currently available in the first, like the initial versions of Blazor or in .NET Core natively. So what are some of those capabilities? So Octane provides you with all of these services in this top box here. So things like multi-tenancy, which is not something that is natively provided through either Blazor or .NET Core and is fairly complex to develop yourself. So Octane has a built-in multi-tenancy model, which you can take advantage of. It uses dynamic routing instead of static routing, and I'll talk about that in a minute. A composite user interface model. It has a modular architecture so that you can plug in modules into the underlying framework. It has a more advanced sort of granular permission model so that it helps you deal with security in your web applications. It has customizable themes that allow you to change the look and feel of your applications. It has a very robust admin user interface, which allows administrators to modify the behavior of the application at runtime. And it has a full API behind it and a repository layer that you can use to build your own applications. And of course, all of this runs on top of Blazor and .NET Core. And because those technologies are cross-platform, of course, this runs on Windows or on Linux. So I said I would dig in a little bit into what I'm talking about when I say a modular application framework. So there's a couple of different types of frameworks that are available to help developers accelerate their development efforts. A very common type is sometimes called a template or a boilerplate application. And this is an application which provides some functionality. You can, of course, maybe download it and you can start building or customizing it to meet your needs. What tends to happen in those types of applications, though, are your custom code becomes very blended with the framework code, and it makes it very difficult then to upgrade the underlying framework as new versions become available. You can contrast that to a modular application framework like Octane, where the framework is cleanly abstracted away from the modules that you would create. And so the modules are plugged in dynamically at runtime, but the code is very cleanly separated from the underlying framework. And the benefit to this model, of course, is that when new versions of the framework become available, you can upgrade that independently from the modules. And of course, we maintain backwards compatibility. So the upgrades become a lot more seamless. And so then you can service your application much more effectively as you move forward into the future. The other thing to note, and I already touched on the concept of modules here, but one of the concepts that's very popular in the industry right now is a term known as micro front ends. And micro front ends are becoming quite popular in the single page application world for JavaScript frameworks. But in fact, Octane also has a micro front end concept to it as well. On the left-hand side, you have sort of the standard way that applications have been built. Well, I guess modern applications are being built in this way. So you would have microservices to provide a lot of the functionality for the back end, but you still have a monolithic front-end application. And the problem there is, I mean, you might have many different groups that are working on the code within that monolithic front end, stepping on each other's toes and perhaps causing issues. And it can cause a lot of difficulties when you're developing a very large application. You can contrast that to the diagram on the right-hand side where we have still the same microservices, but your application is broken up into modules. So the modules represent the front-end functionality for different types of business functionality that you want to expose through the application. And so this is obviously a much better model because you have, again, clean abstractions between your different services and also your user interface as well. So it allows your teams to work much more independently and with less chances of causing issues with dependencies between one another, and they can be deployed independently as well. Octane is a client-server application. So for those of us who are building modern applications, often with JavaScript frameworks like Angular or React or Vue or others, I mean, we're familiar with this model where you have a single page application where a lot of the actual functionality of the application is serviced by the client itself. So, I mean, the client makes the initial request to the server, gets back the initial page of HTML, and then from that point on, it's actually the client which is making sort of more granular calls back to the server to get data. This is the exact same model that is used in Blazor. And it's the model that Octane uses as well. One thing I should probably point out here is that there are a couple different hosting models that you can use with Blazor. You can use Blazor Server or Blazor WebAssembly. In the Blazor Server model, all of the application actually runs on the server in that model, and it uses SignalR to maintain the connection with the client. Octane does support that model as well. But in order to make the underlying framework capable of running on WebAssembly, the overall framework is built in a client-server manner. When we talk about dynamic page routing, and this talks a little bit about multi-tenancy as well, you can set up basically as many sites as you want, and a site is basically just a record in the database, which is associated to a domain name and perhaps even some domain name with some subfolders. And so when a route is interpreted by the router, it basically looks at the domain name and it looks it up in the route table, and it determines which site that belongs to. And then it looks at the rest of the URL path to determine what page you're looking for. And again, it looks that up in the database. And basically, this is how it does dynamic page routing. So when you create an application using Octane, you're actually not creating physical pages, and you're not creating page components either, which is the traditional way that you would build a Blazor application. You are actually constructing your pages dynamically based on configuration that you provide when you basically create your site. Moving on from there, we have our composite user interface. So that the user interface has the notion of a sort of a virtual page, which I already described, right? There is no physical pages. It's a virtual page, which is driven from configuration from the database. That page can be associated to a theme, and the theme provides the look and feel for the overall appearance of the page. That theme has content regions, which we refer to as panes. So you can have a left pane and a right pane, or a content pane, a top pane, as many different panes as you want. And this is where you're going to dynamically inject the content, which are basically your modules, which are your mini applications that you're building, which are plugged in at runtime and instantiated dynamically. And so in this model, you'll see that the theme itself is a Razor component. The containers around the modules are Razor components, and the modules themselves are Razor components. So this is all based on Razor components, but it's all built in a very dynamic way. Whereas, in a traditional Blazor application, all of these things are embedded very statically, so they'd be hard-coded within the components themselves. In the Octane application, it's generated dynamically. And then we get on to the modular component routing area. And so obviously when you build an application, you need to be able to expose a lot of different types of functionality that are part of the module. And so a module is not just one Razor component. It can be comprised of many Razor components that provide the full functionality. So in this example, if we look at the right, the Razor components for a module might include an index component, which is your main view of the content that you want to expose to the end user. If someone clicked on a button that maybe said edit on the index component, you might want to launch a modal dialog that had an edit setting, which allowed you to enter a bunch of additional fields. You could have a settings component. You can have as many components as you need to build out your basically your application. And then the way that the modular routing works is it again looks at the URL. There's basically a path separator, which is the asterisk. And anything that's after that, it basically assumes that would be a module ID. So that would be an ID that can then be mapped back to the configuration in the database. And so in this case, module ID 1, and then it has an action sort of name as well. And so for edit, it looks that up. So it looks up module ID 1, action is edit, and it knows which component that needs to instantiate dynamically based on its type name. And all of this information is, of course, stored in the database. And that's basically how pages are generated. And with that, I'm going to shift over now to actually doing a more live demonstration. But if you're interested in learning more about Oqtane, you can, of course, visit the website at octane.org. That provides some information about the product. The main location for the source code in the community is on GitHub at the Oqtane/Octane.framework site. And then there is a number of other projects, which I'll show you in a moment as well, which are included in that repo. So I'm going to switch over now to my browser, and I'm going to show you. So this is the Oqtane repo for the Oqtane organization. As I mentioned, the Oqtane framework project is where all the source code for the framework resides. And there's a few other projects, sample projects here as well, of example modules and an example theme. So if you're looking to build extensions for Oqtane, you can see some code examples that are in the repo. So if we go into the Oqtane framework repo, this is where, of course, you could get access to the code. You can download it, you can fork it, whatever you would like to do to pull it down to your local environment. In terms of getting up and running, there is some instructions here on how to get started. Of course, you have to be running .NET Core 3.1. We recommend that you run Visual Studio 2019, the preview edition. Oqtane relies on a database, and currently it only supports SQL Server or the desktop version of SQL Server called LocalDB. So you have to at least have these elements set up in your environment as well. Of course, you download the code and then you open the solution, and that's what I'm going to show you next. And I mean, there's other instructions here if you want to install a release version of Oqtane on IIS, or I mean, there's the button up at the top here. You can deploy it to Azure. This was a feature that Michael Washington recently provided, which is really appreciated because it makes it really easy for people to deploy the application to the Azure environment. We have a roadmap and I guess a lot of screenshots here about what the application looked like when you're running it, but I'm going to show you that in a more live form here. So as we can see here, I've opened the Oqtane solution. The solution is comprised of a number of different projects. So there's a client project and a server project, and this is obviously because this is a client-server application. So the client represents all of the components that are going to be used for rendering the user interface. The server project is for all the backend, so all of your APIs, all of your repositories. The shared project has the models to define the classes that are going to be obviously shared between the client and the server. There's a test project for automated tests, and then an upgrade project for helping with providing automated upgrades. But I'm going to more focus just on the client and the server project. If I go into the server project, we have an app settings.json file. And this provides some of the configuration options for the application. One thing I'm going to point out is by default, there isn't a runtime node, which there probably should be, but you can specify runtime of server, which would say I'm going to run this application on Blazor server. But simply by changing it to WebAssembly, that means that you want to run the application in WebAssembly. So it's basically just one configuration setting that you have to change to basically change the hosting model that you want to run the application under, because it supports both. And this is quite powerful because we wanted the ability for developers to be able to choose the hosting environment of their choice. Connection string here is set to blank at the moment, which means when I run this, it needs to actually set up the database for me. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do that now. So when I run the application, it's going to recognize that I don't have a database connection set up yet, and it's going to give me an installation wizard. So I'm running version 102, which is the latest release version. I'm going to accept the defaults, which basically say I want to install this using the local DB, which I have installed. So that makes it really easy for development purposes. It generated automatically a default database name for me and use integrated security. I'm going to create my initial administrator account. The email address is not so important, so I'm just going to put in an address. I'm going to say install now. So basically what this does is it constructs my connection string for me. It executes all of the database configuration needed to basically provision a database for me. And it also provisions some default content. So it created a home page for my application with some default content, including the licensing, a private page, and a my page. So it's some basic pages that are part of this initial default site. We can also see that there's some administrative options as well. If I click on the pencil, it means I go into a mode called edit mode. And when I'm in edit mode, I can see the content regions that are part of my page. So this particular theme only has a content pane. It doesn't have any other panes that are part of it. But we can say that this content pane has a module with content that's generated at the top here, another module here, and another module here. So there's actually 3 different modules that are rendered dynamically within this content pane. We also see that there is a module actions menu. If I hover over this caret here, we can see that there's additional functionality that's exposed for managing this particular module instance on the page. So I can rearrange the order of the module. I can manage settings. I can do various things. So if we go out of edit mode, I'll explain the other option that's here. So if we go into the control panel, which you get into by accessing this gear icon, we have access to the admin dashboard. We have page management options, which allow us to add additional pages dynamically. We can edit the settings of the current page, delete pages. We also have the ability to publish and unpublish the content of the page. The module management section allows us to add additional content to the current page that we're on with some different configuration options. First of all, I'm going to just show you the admin dashboard. So if we go into the admin dashboard, it exposes a lot of this admin functionality that I was mentioning when I was talking through the PowerPoint slides. So got things like managing the settings for the site, managing the full list of pages that are present on the site, managing the users, because this is a system that actually is built on users and permissions. And so you can set up as many users as you want. Users are associated to roles, and this is all using the .NET Core identity system under the covers. You also have an extensible profile management system for defining the user profile attributes you want to track. File management, so a way to upload files and manage files amongst folders that you create. Recycle bin for content that you may have deleted that you want to either restore or delete permanently. An event log so that you can actually see a full audit trail of the activities that are happening in this particular site. We get over to tenant management now, and this is where we get into the multi-tenant aspect. So by default, it created a single tenant and a single site for me. When I go into the site management, we see that there is only the one site that's created. If I want to create an additional site, I can give it a name. I can say the URL, what it should respond to, the default theme for the site. And this is where we can say what tenant it belongs to. I can say I want to put it in the master tenant, which is the default tenant, which means that I would have two different sites that are part of the same tenant. And when I'm talking about tenants, I'm actually referring to a distinct database where the information for a site is going to be stored. So if I choose master, we would have 2 sites stored in the master database. However, I can actually say I want to create a new tenant. And in this case, the second site would actually be stored in its own database. So you can actually have an individual, unique, and like distinct database for each site if you so desire. And this is obviously important if you want to keep the information for each of your sites physically separated from one another. If I go back into my admin dashboard, I can see that in the tenant area, I only have one tenant. It's the master tenant, and that's my master. If I go back into the min dashboard, you can manage the list of modules that are present in the site. You can manage all the themes that are in the site. It's also got the ability to manage background tasks. So you can have scheduled jobs that you create that run in the background for your site. And in fact, if I go into the scheduled jobs, we'll see that it has a notification job. So it has the ability so that modules can create notifications to users, and then it actually sends those out on a background task so that it doesn't use up the foreground thread. SQL management allows you to go in and administrate the database by running SQL queries against it. System info basically tells you some information about the system. It tells me I'm running Oqtane 102. I'm running on Blazor's server. This would say WebAssembly if I was running on WebAssembly. Tells me what version of the CLR I'm using and a few other pieces of information. I can also go into, say I want to access the framework API. And so we actually have Swagger behind the scenes configured so that you can see that there's a very robust set of APIs that are all available for building applications on Oqtane. So files, folders, your scheduled jobs, your modules, notifications, your pages, profile information, your roles, your settings, your site information, your tenants. I mean, all of the APIs are available for you to utilize when you're writing your own modules. And I think lastly, we have a system update where there's an automated way to upgrade the framework for you. By simply, it allows you to download from NuGet and then update the framework automatically. So that's some of the functionality. If I go into maybe this private page for a moment, I can go back into my control panel and I can say I want to add a new module from my common modules, and I'll just use the HTML text module. I can give it a title saying, what do I want to call it? I'll just call it test, and I'll add the module to the page. So it added it to the page. It adds it to the bottom of the current pane by default. If I go into edit mode, I can see that there's the edit button. There's a rich text editor that's available here that I can enter some content in. I can say save, and my content is displayed here now. So, I mean, very simple to add modules to the page. I'm going to actually delete some of these modules here. So those are gone. So one of the main things that you want to do with a framework like Oqtane is you want to build modules, right? That's the whole point of it, is you want to extend the functionality with your own functionality. And so the easiest way to do that to get started today is that you would go into the control panel. Again, you want to go into the module management area and say you want to add a new module. But I'm going to choose from a different category called developer modules. And then I would choose my module creator. And I'm going to add that to the page. And it basically adds an instance of a module to the page. What this does is it allows you to specify specific information about your module. So the owner name would be, the name of the organization or the developer who's actually creating this particular module. So it'd be like, say my company. The module name would be what functionality you're providing. So if I wanted to create a module that's managing maybe cars, I'd put in car, put in the description car, and then I have the ability to choose from some templates. And basically what these templates are is a full set of code that's going to be used for scaffolding out a module. And it's going to use tokenization to replace the necessary tokens with the information that you provided here. I have the ability to choose two different types of templates. So, I mean, if I'm just getting started and I want a very simple way to get started in a way that's, really easy to get up and running and debug, I can choose internal. Internal means it's actually going to place the code of this module within the Oqtane solution. And I'll show you where it's going to put it in a moment. External is most likely what most developers will want to utilize, because this allows you to create an external module. So your code is completely physically separate outside of the Octane framework itself. And so it gives you a location where it's going to scaffold out the code. And so, I mean, I've already created a module previously. So if I looked in my, not there, if I look in my underlying file system, I can see that my Octane framework is located here. This is where all the code for the Octane framework is. And I created a dnf.projects module, which it creates at the same level. And it generated a whole lot of code for me, including the client project, the server project, a packaging project, a shared project. So all of this code was generated for me and provided me with a starting point, including the solution file, project files, everything, so that all the references were set up correctly. Of course, I can open that in Visual Studio as well. And like I said, there's a client, server, shared, and a package project. And we can see that it actually generated, like a Razor components for me. It generated API controllers for me, manager, like repository classes for me. So it generated a lot of the code for me so that I could get up and running very quickly. And all I would have to do at this point is if I was in debug mode, I would just basically compile this. It would compile this module for me, and it would actually deploy the DLLs that were created into my Octane framework. And it does that through this packaging mechanism. So, I mean, it's got a debug command file, which is run sort of as a post-build operation, and it basically X-copies the DLLs from this particular module into my Octane framework. And this is all generated for me as part of the module creator. So it scaffolded out this file with all of these paths for me, so I didn't have to worry about, trying to hand code some of this stuff. So, and this is one of the easiest way to get started with Octane using the module creator. And I think with that's a pretty comprehensive overview of what Octane can provide as far as a framework is concerned. And so, and like I said, the main purpose behind Octane is that if you want to build a Blazor application, of course, you could use something very simple like the Blazor templates that are provided by Microsoft. But if you want a more robust application with a full architecture, client and server, which actually runs on both Blazor server and Blazor WebAssembly, you could use Octane, and it would get you quite a ways down the path of creating a functional application. And you could focus on just building your specific functionality as modules, which plug in dynamically.
Well, I think, Sean, that's a lot to be taken away in the first like 30 to 35 minutes. I think you've covered everything from micro, front end, Blazor server, WebAssembly, dynamic page routing, composite user interfaces, admin functionality, module management, and you have gone through the entire demos. I love the part that you can do so many things in the admin. You can look at your users, your databases. You can add modules on the fly. So it looks like a pretty mature framework. This Octane is. Um, Quick question, Sean, is if someone has already installed Octane in the environment and they again want to get started with the new version, how should one approach with that?
So that's a good question. So making the framework easy to upgrade is a very high priority right from the beginning, and because I guess, and that's what I was alluding to, right, with when I was presenting in the PowerPoint about the approach of using sort of a more of a template approach or a boilerplate approach. That makes it much more difficult to upgrade. I think I mentioned here in the admin dashboard, there is a system update capability where normally, so I'm running the latest version. If there was a newer version that was available on NuGet, it should actually automatically tell me here that there's a newer version, and I should just be able to click a button and it would download the latest version from NuGet and it would install it for me. I can also upload. So if I have, if I don't want to download from NuGet, I can actually upload a framework version here and then do the installation. In the current version, which is 1.02, there is, I think, an issue related to to this particular area. And so we're still, working through resolving that, and probably that'll be available in the next version. So even though I guess you mentioned that it looks very mature, this framework is very mature, but we're still at only a 1.02 release version. So we're still, working through some of the minor issues. Because functionally it's very powerful, but there are of course still a few issues here and there. But yeah, the goal is to be able to upgrade very seamlessly. And I think one thing that we haven't done so far is provide an upgrade package if you want to do it manually yourself. We provide an install package. So if I went into here, we can actually, on the Octane framework GitHub page, we can see that there are some releases here. 1.02 is the latest release. And if I go into that, we can see the packages that are available here. So the Octane framework install version is available if you want to do a manual installation. There should probably be an upgrade as well if you want to do a manual upgrade. And so that's a package we need to still provide. But the goal is basically if you overlay the files that are provided over top of your existing installation and just run the application in your browser, it will run the necessary upgrade scripts for the database for you. Very similar to the way that .NetNuke worked. And so this will be the way that you can very easily upgrade from one version to the next without having to require a lot of technical knowledge.
That's great. I think I like that option that you can just go ahead and maybe just update your environment from the admin itself. Uh,
Yeah.
Sean, I have been looking at your demos, right? And I saw you have been doing all that inside the Visual Studio, right? But
Yep.
these days, Visual Studio Code is like very popular and handy. So is it possible to install Octane without using Visual Studio?
Yes, it is. So you can use, you can use VS Code. You can use JetBrains Rider as well. We have members that are in our community that are using JetBrains Rider as well as their preferred IDE. So that is one of the goals, is that you can use different IDEs. And in fact, maybe I should touch on that for a moment. So if I go back here, I can go to the Octane website. And if I go into the blog area, this isn't a very sort of important blog for people to read if they want to learn a bit more about Octane. So the Octane philosophy blog, which I posted at the beginning of the year, contains a lot of the overarching sort of philosophy and goals that we're trying to achieve with this project. So there's a lot of different points here. One of them was this, tooling agnostic. So one of the goals is that we should support IDEs other than just Visual Studio. So, but there's a lot of different aspects here. I think actually backwards compatibility and upgradability is here as well. So, there's a lot of things that people should be aware of in terms of the overarching goals that Octane is being built to adhere to. But yes, you should be able to use other IDEs with Octane. One thing that I should note though is the version of Visual Studio that I'm using. Yes, I'm using the preview edition of Visual Studio 2019, but I'm using the community edition. So I'm using the most basic Visual Studio edition that is completely free for running Octane. So, and there are no limitations. So that's one thing that's important to note.
So I think there's a freedom to choose most of the popular IDEs that we have, and then we can go ahead and start building our solution. Right. So let's go ahead and take one question from the viewers. Mahesh says, "A great presentation, Sean. Could you share thought on .NET Core / Blazor dependency and compatibility?"
.NET Core and Razor
Blazor.
compatibility? Blazor compatibility. Okay. So I guess if you want to use the full functionality of Blazor, and that would include the latest release of Blazor that is using that supports WebAssembly and server, which was released, I don't know, I think that was in May of this year, so only 3 or 4 months ago. Then of course you need to be running .NET Core 3.1.4, I believe. If we go back to the list of, yeah, so I mean, if I link through here, that's not what I wanted to do. I guess I'm linking directly there to a download. But anyways, yeah, so version, 3.1.300. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I mean, that's the version of .NET Core you should be running when you are using Blazor, if you want to get the full functionality of Blazor. Microsoft is also currently working on the next version of Blazor, which will be part of .NET Core. Basically, they're calling that .NET 5, and there is a lot of excellent features that are coming as part of that. But I'm not quite sure what the release date for .NET 5 is at the moment.
All right, Sean. So, talking about the compatibility, as we see, the latest .NET Core 3.1 has an long-term support for December 3, 2020, right? And going forward, is there any I should say latest version one should be running? Or how should one have an approach when this .NET Core keeps on changing with the new version?
That's a good question. So the version of Blazor that was shipped in May is not a long-term support version, which means that, there'll be another version coming that probably will be the long-term support version. But if you want to get started with Blazor now, then you're just going to have to be aware that that particular release version is not an LTS version. And I know this is really, I think whoever's asking the question, it is challenging to try and navigate the .NET Core versions that Microsoft provides. Typically, I think people want to choose the LTS versions because they know that if they build an application on that it's sort of guaranteed to be supported for a longer period of time. However, Blazor is such a new technology that I guess Microsoft didn't feel comfortable giving it the LTS moniker quite yet, at least for the WebAssembly version. I believe the previous version, the Blazor server version, which was released, I think that was in November, was an LTS version. So, if you're comfortable building applications on Blazor server as your hosting model, then I think that there is an LTS version that you could use.
That's great. So let's take one more question from the comments from Bhaskadas. He says, is there any documentation and help available in Octane? Of course, we have shared, or I have also shared the GitHub and the Octane website URL. But here's something that we would like to know is there any community like forum and all available where people can go and interact with other community members?
Yeah, so as far as a discussion forum, the website links to Discuss here, which actually links to a Gitter repository currently. There's a lot of discussions that are happening in the Gitter room related to Octane. I think there's like 91 people who have joined this Gitter room over time. We're actually debating this morning about moving to GitHub Discussions. However, GitHub Discussions doesn't seem to be available to all projects yet. It's still in beta. So we're still trying to find the best mechanism for allowing people to discuss. But Gitter is actually pretty good. It's, a real-time discussion system. And as far as community, of course, through the through the GitHub repository as well. People obviously are logging issues, and quite often there's discussions that happen on the issues themselves. And there's been quite a lot of pull requests over time as well. So, there's definitely a community that has formed around. Actually, if we go back to the code tab, there's been like 19 people who have contributed so far via pull requests to Octane. So even though it's a pretty young open source project, there's definitely been quite a bit of interest already.
Coming back to the topic of Blazor, Sean, there are some limitations in the Blazor that one cannot do. One of the popular limitation was uploading the file, right? So, is there any more features that Octane provides on the fly which are not available in Blazor?
Yes, quite a lot of them. Yeah, so I think I closed this down. So we'll go back to the project here. We'll run it. So yeah, so I think initially you're right. Microsoft released Blazor without some sort of, I guess, functionality, which is pretty common in a lot of applications. And that's one of the reasons why I created Octane, is to fill in those gaps. So, I mean, in the admin dashboard, I mean, the file manager, if I want to upload files, we've got a good sort of uploading file mechanism here, which is implemented in a client server manner. And it actually allows you to upload multiple files. It breaks them up into chunks and uploads them on multiple threads. So, I mean, it's quite a powerful uploading mechanism. You've also got the ability to download files directly from a URL. If you know a URL on the web that's accessible, I mean, you can put it in and it'll download it directly as well. So certainly that's a capability that is available. One of the other things when you're developing applications on Blazor, which is a bit challenging, is accessing elements in the head of the page. And Octane has JavaScript interop methods that it provides so that it can set, like, for example, if you want to set the title of the tab in the browser, that would be a head element, right? And that's not something that Blazor currently provides an ability to do. Octane has APIs for that using JS interop so that you can set those elements. Managing JavaScript files is also challenging in Blazor currently. And it doesn't sort of have a native way of dealing with JavaScript dependencies between files. And so actually, if I switch over to this DNF projects, I can show you an example. If I go into my index component here, we have the ability so that you can define the resources for your module. So in this case, this module has a custom CSS file that needs to be loaded dynamically when this module is rendered. It also relies on chart.js, which is a JavaScript charting component, and then it also has its own custom JavaScript file as well, which depends upon chart.js. So they have to be loaded in a specific order, or else you're going to get error messages in the browser. So this kind of functionality is something that Blazor does not provide currently. I think it's something Microsoft is working on in .NET 5, but so this is another capability that's quite useful when you're developing Blazor applications. And this is something obviously that Octane provides. There's also a variety of other, if we go into the Octane client project in the modules area, we look at controls. So, I mean, we've got a set of reusable controls that can be used in any module. So, I mean, if you want to render, buttons which have the appropriate linking mechanisms for the dynamic routing in Octane, you would use these Razor components that are here. If you got the file manager, which you can put into your own module so that you can upload files. Label component, which provides field level help, like a paging grid display, so that you can, if you have a whole lot of information and you want to be able to provide paging, you can do that. A rich text editor is provided by default as well, which you can also embed in your modules. So there tabs and tab strips. I mean, there's a lot of things, a lot of reusable components that are already built as part of Octane that you can just use. Of course, you could also use third-party component suites like those available from Telerik or Infragistics or various component companies as well. We just provide some of the most common ones that are needed as part of our user interface, because we don't want to put a dependency on any specific commercial component suite at this point.
It looks like, Shaun, this is a topic you can go ahead and talk maybe for an entire day, like different benefits that you have from Blazor. But
Yep.
let me go ahead and give you one Blazor question. If you can look at the screen, it's from Amit. He says, Blazor client model seems taking time to load all the runtime libraries and dependencies to the client machine, no
Yep.
matter what would be the size. How to overcome this issue?
So it really depends, I guess, on how large of an application you're building, because the point with Blazor WebAssembly is, in fact, that it's actually transferring when you run the application for the first time. It is going to download all of the DLLs to the client browser because that's where the functionality is going to be running. And so, of course, that takes some time to do that download. Microsoft is working on optimizing that. They did some optimizations in the Blazor WebAssembly release that is already available now, but they're doing more optimizations in .NET 5. As far as how you can manage that, there is currently not a native ability to do lazy loading. And so I guess what I refer to in that regard is, rather than downloading all of the assemblies when your browser starts up, like so when you run your Blazor WebAssembly application in the browser, currently it downloads all of the DLLs that are needed for the entire application. Lazy loading would allow you to only download the specific DLLs that are needed for rendering that specific view, right? The initial view, and then as you navigate to subsequent pages that are part of your Blazor application, it would download the additional DLLs on demand. That is something that Microsoft is working on for .NET 5 as well. And that's a way that you're going to be able to sort of break up your application so that it's not one big download hit, right? It's spread across the entire sort of user interaction that a user might be involved in. And in fact, I really want to take advantage of that capability in Octane as well, because there's a lot of users that are going to visit a site that only have access to view the content and have no access to the administrative aspects. And so why should they have to download all of the additional, administrative functionality that is, contained within DLLs if they're never going to use it? And that's the same approach that we've taken with the CSS style sheet solution that we have in Octane today. So if I'm on this page, it's only going to load the specific CSS files that are needed for this page, not all of the CSS files that are needed for the entire application. Similarly for JavaScript. So it's currently, Octane is using a lazy load approach when it comes to style sheets in JavaScript, and we want to extend that for assemblies as well.
All right, so you mean by going forward, things will improve. Blazor itself is still very new, and so is Octane. Going forward, things will improve. Having said that, Sean, moments back you did mention about chart.js, which is pretty interesting library, and you did mention about JavaScript a couple of times. Here's one quick question, maybe you can answer: is what is actually the difference? Not difference, but why should one choose Octane, whereas there's so many JavaScript libraries already available? Right? What is that couple of benefits that Octane or maybe Blazor provides other than these libraries? Because I have seen many .NET guys using the different JavaScript libraries with them. So what's with these two?
Right. Yeah. So I think the question is more, why would you choose Blazor versus choosing a JavaScript framework such as Angular or React, which are very mature frameworks with like large ecosystems around them already. And I think that the answer to that is a lot of developers that were traditionally back-end developers are not that comfortable with JavaScript. Right? And so what's ended up happening over time in the industry is there's been specializations that have been happening where you'll have back-end developers and front-end developers, and you'll have to basically include both types of resources on your projects, and because it is a different skill set. And so with something like Blazor, you can use, you can have a resource with a single skill set, right, who understands how to write C#, and they can participate both writing the user interface components and writing the backend. So I think for a lot of developers, that's a really compelling story. And that's a really, compelling story for myself as well. I'm not a big fan of writing a lot of JavaScript. Sometimes you do have to resort to using JS interrupt in Blazor, but for the most part, the component model is very powerful, and I would prefer to write my user interface logic in a rich language like C# as opposed to JavaScript.
I think guys coming from a .NET or a C Sharp background, it gets very handy for them to move into Blazor rather than moving into entire new JavaScript framework where many people may not be comfortable. Also, we had an AMA with Michael Washington who did show the different type of boilerplates you get in the Angular and React framework, whereas it is very much small, precise, to the point boilerplates you get in the Blazor. Definitely, that is one of the benefits. I have shared all the links in the comments, like GitHub link. You can just follow github.com/octane/octane.framework. I have also shared Octane official website, that is octane.org. You guys can go ahead and get started with that. They have tons of resources, the blogs, and also the GitLab discussions that we have. Before we just wrap up here at the time, Sean, I would like to know what are some of the, is there any some of the quick updates one should be expecting in the near future?
There is actually a large list of features that have been requested. So if we look at the roadmap, these are some of the things that are on the roadmap to come. After the initial 1.0 release, which was, we timed that with the Blazor WebAssembly release in late May, we had a couple of releases where we just wanted to focus on making sure the framework was highly stable, and just making sure that we worked through any of the bugs that were in it. And some of these items that are on this list for VNext are much more substantial. Like, for example, localization is a big one. We would like to provide a localization solution so that the user interface is available in languages other than just English. Support for other databases other than just SQL Server, and that could tie in with database migrations. Currently, we're using a script-based approach, but we would like to use migrations. The admin UI, it's developed in sort of a consistent manner currently, but it's maybe not developed in a fully mobile-friendly manner. It uses it basically needs some optimization, and there's been some members in the community who would like to tackle that area. Also, currently we're using the pattern which I think was most common when Blazor first was documented, which is we just use .razor files. We don't use the code behind pattern. There's been some suggestion that developers would like if Octane was moved to the code behind pattern, which will involve some effort. Supporting other forms of authentication. Currently, it uses like a cookie-based authentication, and it also, so this is another area which is somewhat different in Octane than it is in the default Blazor templates. In the default Blazor templates, if you wanted to use like server-side Blazor and you want to use authentication, it actually uses the Razor pages from the .NET Core identity, which doesn't provide a very good user experience because you're basically shifting from Blazor to Razor pages and then back again, and it's really hard to keep the themes consistent between them. Octane doesn't do that. Octane uses a native Razor component model for the user interface for authentication. So these are some of the features that are coming, and we're still figuring out how to prioritize these for the coming releases.
Looks like there's a lot of exciting stuff coming in the near future with this Octane. So I think it's time to wrap, Shaun. It has been an amazing session. Thank you so much for your time. Any last words you would like to tell for all those people who has joined us for all this long?
No, I just I really appreciate the opportunity of being on the show. I've been a fan of this show for a long time, and I've never been a guest. So, and I have to thank Michael Washington for that because he made the introductions. So, shout out to Michael Washington.
All right, so thank you so much, Shaun, and thank you everyone who has watched and stayed with us for all this long. Shaun, I, Stephen Simon, on behalf of the entire CSharpCorner community and its millions of users, would like to thank you for your valuable time and contributing to the community. And to all the viewers, I'll catch you in the next episode of Ask Me Anything series, Thursday, 10 a.m. EST. Thank you.